turn down the master so the gain seems a little lower.
Sit. I got no problem talking loud. Talking too much. Talking too long.
Perfect.
All
right.
All the same. Was it ours?
I think it's time.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is the second presentation for KeyCon this year. This is, by the way, this is the one about switches and switch force curves. So if you think this is the one about artisans, you're not going to hurt my feelings if you get up and leave now. If you get up and leave in 10 minutes time, that might be a little bit of a different story. So this presentation we're going over is titled Data Underneath Your Keycap, or your fingertips, excuse me. And it's about what switch force curves are and what they can tell us in the community. My name's Go, but I recognize that some of you here may not know who I am, the lucky amongst you who don't. And so, to introduce myself, there we go. I'm a mechanical keyboard enthusiast and switch collector. I've been involved in the hobby since late 2017. Have been actively collecting switches since 2018, and since 2019, I've been writing full-length switch reviews over at my website, which we see here, therewego.com. To date, I think I've published a little over 120 different switch reviews that have all the information you'd ever want to know about these switches and everything you wouldn't want to know as well. And nowadays, we're up to about 25 to 30 pages worth of information per review. In addition to that, I have shorts. I also have stuff on Reddit, Twitter, Instagram, GitHub, and a whole lot more. And if that's not a sufficient demonstration that I am capable of talking about switches for a half hour, I'll go ahead and appeal to authority again and show my switch collection since it wasn't able to keep the journey here to DC with us. So my switch collection looks a little something like this, or at least this is what it looked like back in 2018 when I first started collecting. I had just got off the high of buying my first mechanical keyboard, an Avanzian Pro V1 with Gate-Around Browns, and I knew that I was going to buy a new one. I had to. But I wanted it to be a discerning keyboard enthusiast. So I wanted to buy switches for a different set of switches for my board, but I didn't know what I wanted to buy. So what I bought was this. This is the KBD Fan 63 slot switch tester that I'm sure many of us are familiar with. Back in the day when I got mine, they actually had clear keycaps, not the pattern ones they did now. And I played with it for hours on end, for multiple days on end, and said, yes, I really like this. I have switches in mind, but I want to be a truly discerning keyboard enthusiast. So why don't I buy the rest of it? Why don't I just go ahead and collect the rest of the switches? And that question has plagued me for at least the last 7 years and has led to something that looks a bit like this. This is my switch collection, actually not the most up-to-date. This is as of March of this year. And so while the photo down there says 3,500 switches, I have a little over 3,570 unique different keyboard switches, which are all photographed here in a roughly 10-foot by 6-foot layout on my living room floor, in case the scale doesn't really sell you. The majority of what you see here, the majority of my collection, are what are known as modern switches. So they're MX-style switches that were produced from 2014 and beyond. Though I have special subsections of Alps, pre-production prototypes, and historically relevant switch families, things like Zelios, Stelios, so on. I'm an engineer by trade myself, and when you have this many switches, you like to try and find different ways you can categorize them. Everything here is grouped by brand or manufacturer. But after a while, they all start to blend together, right? And so I try and find ways to talk about switches in objective, quantifiable ways. How can we really put numbers to differentiate each of these 3,500 something switches from one another? And the way that we can do this is through force curves. And more specifically, we collect them using a force curve tester. This is my force curve tester that I have. It was gifted to me in 2023 by the CEO of Drop. This is a very expensive piece of lab equipment, and I'm very thankful for them donating it. The CEO was a reader of my articles at the time, and he said, we don't want any attributions, we don't want any sort of praise, anything of the sort. I just want you to make force curves, because I feel like if there's anyone who's going to do it, it would be you. And so I have. What we have is a force curve. This is one of the many that I've collected over the years on the top left-hand corner here. And it's for a Cherry MX Brown switch. For those of you who've read my reviews before, you'll recognize this is my format, very white, blank background, and then 2 lines, black downstroke and silver up upstroke. But I have not just collected one since 2022. I've actually collected a little over 1,800 different published force curves for 1,600 different switches, which are hosted over at my GitHub as we see here. And all of my processed and raw data is available for anyone who wants to see this for any of the switches I've collected, as well as the stuff we'll talk about today. But for those of you who have not read my reviews much or aren't really familiar with what force curves are, you probably are like, gee, who really cares? You know, what do these things show us? And so in order to get some sort of appreciation of that, we should probably talk about what even a force curve is. So aside the fact that it is an objective, quantifiable way for us to talk about switches, it is most simply described as a plot of force versus displacement. On your vertical axis, you have how heavy the switch feels underneath your fingers. And the displacement is effectively how far you press the switch. So in a way, if we wanted to go halfway through a cherry MX Brown switch and actuate it, we could see that at 2 millimeters, you would have a feeling of about 40 to 45 grams of force underneath your fingers. And so it objectively tells us kind of what we'd be feeling in the switches. But we also know that there's more things we can get out of these. For instance, almost everyone here should know that cherry MX Brown switches are tactiles. We could also see that in this force curve because of their tactile bumps. We have this nice wave up and down here in the middle. Clicky switches, linear switches as well, also look different. Clicky switches, because they also have feedback, look a little something like this. You get this big arcing bump, and then a quick drop off, or in this instance where your click bar would finish. And linear switches, while they do ordinarily being switches that don't have any feedback and are just straight up and down, their name is even more applicable when it comes to force curves because their force curves are, in fact, straight lines. This is a force curve for cherry MX RGB black switches. And so while that's neat, and we do understand that this will tell us effectively how heavy a switch feels at any given time, there's still some more interpretation that we need to have here. For one, there's 2 different lines, right? We have a black downstroke and a silver upstroke line. I'm not certain that everyone necessarily knows what those are. If we think about a switch in its natural resting position like this, and we take it and we depress the stem, that is what's known as the downstroke. It's pushing the stem from its resting position at 0 millimeters all the way down to 4. And so our black downstroke curve is effectively read in your mind from left to right. That's your start all the way over there at the far end, and then it comes to the very end here. The upstroke is the other half of that process. So you've pressed your stem all the way in, and you want to go ahead and release that. That release, or that return, is what is known as the upstroke, or the stem returning back to the top. So your upstroke curve is read in the opposite direction, and it's from right to left. Given that a lot of people tend to press a switch all the way in, and then release that immediately after, people don't often feel the upstroke unless you're a very specific type of typer. So a lot of the discussion moving forward will be on the downstroke for the rest of this presentation, although that should be labeled in most cases. The discerning among you, though, will look at this and say, "Go, this is great. You said this was a linear switch. It has a linear force curve, but I see 3 different sets of lines there. This isn't perfectly straight." And for those of you who have seen that, this is actually important. There's 3 different regions that are important to note in switches as well. For the first one, we have what is known as the start. This is the minimum amount of force it takes to get your switch going. Right? I could try and do a balancing act with 3 things in 2 hands and try and balance this clicker on top of the stem. And you'll see that the stem is not going to progress. There's a minimum amount of force it takes for you to get going. And so that is what we see here in the start region. At the opposite end of the stroke, where you get this very big spike in force, this is what is known as the bottom. This is effectively the end of the switch. This is where your stem is pressed all the way in, and you're effectively just trying to shove the stem through the bottom housing of the switch. You'll note that it's not perfectly straight, because if you mash 2 pieces of plastic together, they do bend and flex a little bit. But this is, for all intents and purposes, the end of the switch. And then anything that exists in between here is what is known as the stroke region. For linear switches, this is our linear region. For tactile switches, it could be tactile bumps. This could be anything else worth noting. And so I did make a nice little pause for myself to get a drink, and I put a fancy little GIF over here for you guys to be hypnotized with while I take that. But try and get in your head that left to right downstroke curve and that sort of up and down motion that we see here. So that's great. we now know the direction the force curve.
Yeah, go ahead. So like intuitively, why is the upstroke not force curve not equal to the upstroke force curve?
Sure. This is a perfect time to ask that question as well. So if we looked at this GIF of the switch here, what do we see? And it might be a little hard for those of you to see in the back. Your stem is moving directly up and down, right? And what it's doing is it's pushing this leaf that's curved like this in and out of the way. And so when the stem is pressed all the way in, it's not making contact with that leaf. And as it comes back up and begins to make contact with that leaf, it's pushing the stem up ever so slightly. And what that does is that drops your perceived force, and that's what you get this little bit of force. Interestingly, this is a feature of just MX switches. So if you look at Hall effect force curves, they're perfectly straight lines because there's no things. It's just it's a good question. Yeah, sorry.
I noticed that the line is rougher before it releases the contact. It looks as though the contact is adding roughness to it. Is this typical, or is this unique to, say, the Cherry MX Black?
So this is not unique to Cherry MX Black. This sort of roughness appears in all sorts of switches, and we'll get to some more of the discussion of that macro scale roughness. I would hesitate rather to ascribe any sort of micro roughness or scratch to this though. I don't think my machine is capable enough of reaching that sort of force. It reaches out to about 0.1 gram force of force. And if we want to have a discussion about scratch and then lateral distances, your force from a scratchier piece of plastic is not going to be nearly as strong as something like a spring. So we have our linear force curves, and we know how to interpret them. One of the things that I've heard throughout my time in collecting switches in the hobby is that all linear is the same. Linear switches and linear switches and linear. And I wholeheartedly disagree with that. Many of you will have seen my writing on that already and know this to be the case. But since we have force curves and we can interpret them, one of the things we should be able to do is see that. I should be able to line up multiple of these force curves, and we should be able to see how similar they are. So I did that with Cherry MX Red, Cherry MX Black, and Cherry MX Linear Gray, to try and correct for any sort of manufacturing differences. And you get force curves that, well, they don't really look the same. Sure, they all have more or less the same starting point. Yeah, they all bottom out at more or less 4.0 millimeters of displacement, but that stroke region in between is just not quite the same. Because this is a line, because I'm an engineer with too much free time, you can take mathematical interpretations of this, what are known as linear regression, and I can rocket us back to high school math and get an equation of a line for each of these force curves. You'll see up there, underneath each of their labels, we have what is the equation of the line. This is y equals mx plus b form. N is our slope. This is effectively telling us how many grams of force your linear switch goes up per gram or per millimeter of displacement. Well, for MX Red switches, it's about 7 grams per millimeter of stroke. But if we look at linear grays, it's way different. It's over double that amount, nearly 15 gram force per millimeter. So that's different. There's at least one difference that exists in linear switches. Another one of these numbers that I tossed up here is what is known as R squared. R squared is a statistical number that effectively tells us how straight this line is. And R squared of 1 is perfectly mathematically straight. Could not get any straighter of a line than that. R squared of 0 is all sorts of wavy, chaos, non-continuous stuff. Well, if we look here at our cherry switches, those are all pretty damn straight. We have 0.99 and then some trailing numbers after that. But the fact that I've chosen to identify that here should probably tell you that that's not always the case with linear switches. And in fact, if I take 3 other linear switches, you can really begin to see the differences between their R squared or their straightness. Our favorite white marbles, for instance, in this purple line are even straighter than the cherry switches out of 0.99 R squared. The KTT purple moons, I mean, just looking at the force curve on their own, they're all sorts of wavy and all over the place. And you're approaching R squared of 0.8. So now that we have 2 different numbers by which we can differentiate linear switches, we should be able to more easily quantify their differences altogether. I mean, you take 2 numbers, put one on the x-axis and one on the y-axis, you can get a plot that looks like this. This is my 4-way linearity plot missing a lot of labels. On the vertical axis, we have linearity, or that R squared value. So this would be an axis from all the way straight at the top to all the way wavy at the bottom. And our horizontal axis is your slope. These are your very flat switches, something like our Cherry MX Reds, to your very steep switches like linear grays. And when you group switches in this fashion, You can get linears that exist in 4 quadrants. You got your super steep, straight, heavy switches at the top, and your flat, wavy switches all the way to the outside. Plotting those 6 switches that we talked about on the previous slides, we get something that looks like this. And all of a sudden we can say, wow, Cherry MX arrays are in fact way steeper and way straighter than not only KeyCon but effectively everything else on this plot. It allows us to quantitatively differentiate
in terms of variation between matches.
Sorry, what was that?
Variation between matches of switches and light.
Sure. So I don't have anything in the slides for that today, but there is a decent amount of variation that exists from force curve to force curve. I tend to take one-offs of my force curves, but for every switch I've done a review on, I've taken sets of 3. And you do see variations, at least in weighting, that exist anywhere plus or minus 5 ranges of force. And then their straightness can vary as well. That would have been a good thing to do.
That's a good question. Coming from a testing background myself, it's just like, like how batch-to-batch variations between certain batches and switches. Sounds like a good pull that. Sure.
Yeah, so the question for those of you who are listening to this recording was on batch-to-batch variation, taking multiple force curves with the same switch and so on and so forth. The testing reproducibility on the force curve machine is pretty accurate, but any given set of switches will vary.
Yeah.
I will say from experience though, if a Cherry MX linear array is up here, you're not going to find one all the way down the corner. As well, since there's at least one other data person in the audience, you're probably like, hey, where the hell are the numbers in this thing? You just talked to us about all this quantification and it's not there. Well, it's there. I promise you that it's there. But the reason I didn't show it is I didn't want to ascribe a specific number. I didn't want to say a switch that's 7 grams per millimeter is steep, and this one's 6.94, so it's not steep. So instead what I've done is in the background, and all the data that you guys can access, I've normalized it. So I've taken the average of all of your linear switches that I've collected, and then done some math to correct these relative to that average. So at the dead center of this plot is truly the mathematically average linear switch. And so in a way, we can quantifiably say that, Cherry MX arrays are really different. And there's also other interesting trends, both in the positive and negative direction of all linears being similar when you plot all of your force curve, or all of these plots together. And this is for the 1,100 different linear switches I've collected today. And what's interesting is that we can see there are truly different linears that exist out there. But on the flip side, some of them are more similar than you might think. People look at very recent HMX switches and think, wow, these are a whole new, hot stuff. They're very different. They'd be way different than a highly made Marandi switch. They're basically right on top of each other. And you think, oh, Marandi switches, these thick, deep housings and really sort of medium to heavy weighted linears would be very similar to something like Gatorade X's or Novelty Screens, and yet they couldn't be further apart. And so while there's a lot of interesting trends we can talk about and you guys can ask about after we're done with this, the one that I'm going to choose to tunnel in on is our absence of switches that exist in the steep and weighted region, right? There's a lot of switches in the other 3, but there's not quite that many. The few outliers that exist this way are truly good switches. You've got ultra low profiles and Cherry's new MV Viola switch, which I'm thankful, Cherry, for you guys sending to me, despite it being kind of weird. But you don't see MX style switches here. And there's a reason for that. If you think about what a steep and wavy force curve might look like, you're going to have ups and downs in the force, you're going to have peaks and valleys. It's not going to be very straight. In fact, it might look something like this. This is audience participation. Does anyone recognize what this force curve is? Or tell me what switch this goes to? Good, okay, I didn't put everyone to sleep. This is the force curve from the beginning of the presentation. This is our Cherry MX Browns. And so, again, throwing up a very fancy gift, we can see that the reason that Cherry MX Browns get this force curve is because that leg has a little bit of a bump that's carved into it. And so what it causes is that leaf that we had talked about in the very next question that was asked earlier to rock back and forth, which gives you that sort of waviness. But this is a talk about quantifying switches, so we should quantify tactiles. But there are some things that are different about tactile switches that aren't linears. For one, they're lump. We have a positive lump and a negative lump region. I do want to say, just to clarify, the entirety of this is the tactile lump. This is a tactile lump through. However, when most people touch on switches, they really only feel this positive region. They go to press, they get this huge jump up in force, and they keep pressing harder and harder until they rocket right past this negative region, into your downstroke. So unless you're typing very carefully, you won't feel this negative bump, which is why I'll choose to focus on the positive one. But note that those are both relevant. As well, because there's a feature that splits this linear region in half. Cherry MX browns are a type of tactile that has also linear, pre, and post-bump regions. Not all tactile switches have this. A lot of them like to start right here at the starting region. And then a very recent one by the name of SiliWorks Type R switches has no post-bump region. But these are features that generally tend to exist in one form or another in tactile switches. And so, how do we quantify this, right? How do we take any of these variables and put numbers in? One of the original ideas that was proposed all the way back in 2016 by Kata, who was one of the first persons who ever did dedicated writing on switch force curves, was you could integrate into that area. And so again, to fortress once more with high school math, for those of you who took calculus course, integrating the area under that curve can be solved by taking the equation of this curve and then finding the area underneath there through calculus. But in a more simple way, we can effectively just shade the area that exists between the bottom axis and that line and say, this is the number that is this tactile. This switch is X number tactile. And while it's a perfectly valid way to quantify tactile switches, I've personally never been a fan of that. And the reason that is because it doesn't really describe a tactile bump relative to the rest of the switch. Say, for instance, you had a hypothetical switch that was just 40 grams per force, heavier across the board, right? We integrated the area underneath that curve and compared it. All of a sudden, you'd be like, wow, that heavier switch is twice as tactile. And that's not true. It is just as tactile as your lighter switch, especially here because it is the exact same switch. But it's the same force relative to itself. So how can we get around it? The way that I've come up and the way that
But it's the same force relative to yourself, but it looks like you just shifted up the curve.
Sure, so we're going to get to the relative to yourself. So I'm saying that these are not relative to yourself. You shifting an up 40 gram force across the board is naturally introducing more of a feeling there that doesn't really exist. How you make it relative to the rest of it is you can do something like this. We can take our downstroke curve and we can connect those starting and bottom of our linear regions with a hypothetical line. And then suddenly, if you integrate that area that exists between that hypothetical line and that, you have a number that quantifies how tactile that is relative to itself. So it doesn't matter if it's all the way up here, it doesn't matter if it's all the way down here, that bump should more or less be it. And so when you drop this hypothetical line method, you can quantify a lot of stuff. It's something like 28 different data points per force curve. One of the things we can quantify is the pre-bump length, slope, and linearity using the same math that I described before with linear regressions. But we can also look at the tactile, we can also look at the area that exists between this hypothetical line, because you can clearly see this green line doesn't perfectly line up with the linear regions for cherry and brown. Now we can use that as a way to quantify this sort of error. You also look at your tactile bumps. For each bump, we can look at how light it is. We can look at how its peak force or how heavy that is. We can also look at roughly where that peak force exists relative to the rest of the switch, and then actually integrate the area underneath for both positive and negative switches. And if we want to get even crazier with it, we can even divide them down the middle, cross from their peak force, left into the right halves, and then repeat all of those numbers again for the left and right halves of those peaks. And when you take all those numbers together and slam them onto one slide, all of a sudden you get something that looks more or less like one of my normal switch reviews. It's a lot. It's a lot to try and get, especially in the time that we have remaining today. And since I'm introducing this for the first time and haven't written anything about it, let's just focus on our positive. So we talk about tactile switches in multiple ways, right? You know, you have your big, strong, heavy tactile bumps, and then you've got your really weak, soft, small ones like your cherry and your friends. So what I propose is that we can quantify tactile switches, again, on two metrics to try and keep everything consistent. And for one, what we can talk about is how wide this bump is, right? This bump on the plot exists from here to here, and that's relatively short. If it arced all the way from here all the way over here, it would be much bigger. The other thing we can talk about is strength, or how much area that's actually shaded inside of this bump. If this bump arcs from here to here, it's one thing, but if it arcs from here all the way up over to here, that have a much bigger area. And so doing the same thing I did with linear squares, and again, plotting everything on an XY plot, we have a 4-way tactility plot. And the tactility plot has a vertical axis that is your tactile bump strength from weak all the way to strong, that's related to its area, or how much area we've shaded. And then it's felt bump width from narrow to wide, how long those are on the horizontal axis. Again, this allows us to group tactile switches into 4 categories. You got your big, wide, strong, your crazy holy panda Franken switch nonsense up here. And at the very bottom is a narrow and weak, you get more towards your cherry springs. And what's neat is when you process this sort of data for 255 tactile switches for every none, you get a distribution that's a little bit like this. So let that one sink in for everyone. I certainly haven't read every single article that exists out there, but to the best of my knowledge, this is the first real attempt that anyone's ever had at quantifying differences between tactiles. And what this plot allows us to do is take some of our favorite tactiles that we love and know and compare them against them, right? Suddenly, despite what you may think, Cherry MX clears don't seem to be nearly as strong, at least not nearly as strong as some of our recent, Duroc JWK super heavy tactiles and Lusetsus. I know I said recent when they're like a few years old. Forgive me. And then at the same time, we can also see that light tactiles are alive and well. Akko's V3 green blues are holding up at the very opposite end and exist in that sort of beginner realm that a lot of people like. And this is interesting. We have a way to quantify differences between tactile switches and comparable. And there's even more trends that we could get from this, and I will get from this eventually when I spend some more months working on this. But just to give you a sense of what another trend might look like that you can extract from data like this is, we'll again look at just the data without the labels. If we think about our strong, heavy, really punchy tactile switches, a lot of them are sold or marketed on having no linear pre-trap. Right at that start, you're starting that tactile bump, and there's no hesitation. So in my mind, knowing that that seems to be a common marketing point, you think that there would be no tactiles that exist up here, there are very few, that have linear pre-travel. On the opposite end, you think that you see a lot more tactiles with linear pre-travel down here. Except when you plot all that data together, it doesn't seem to be true. In fact, it seems as if tactile switches have linear pre-travel irrespective of how strong they are. There's equally linear pre-travel tactile switches that exist in the strong and heavy realm as they do all the way down in the narrow and weak realm as well. There's even more data. There's countless amounts of articles that I could write about the interpretations that can come out of this. And there's a lot of stuff we can look at. Things that I could discuss, for example, are things like asymmetry or lopsided tactile bumps. We have our tactile bump here for Akko oranges, and they don't look quite nearly the same as our Cherry MX browns, right? You've got a sort of tooth feature here. It's really wavy. Your positive region is a lot smaller than your negative region. So maybe some differences that exist there could tell us something about the tactile switches with fields. In the same way, we could also have differences that exist between slope mismatches for your pre and post bump linear regions. If you extend these lines, you see they clearly don't line up. And I'm not entirely certain if that means something. This is something that we get through data processing. It is, well, any sort of quantitative model is not perfect. And so one of the things I can do is calculate the error of how big this is. We already talked about here the fact that your hypothetical line in green will not quite line up there. So there is some error that exists in this method. I will say it's not nearly as bad with most of the tactile switches with the Cherry MX brown, but there's also a lot worse ones as well. So to kind of leave us on a last thought when it comes to force curves and stuff, they're not perfect. I can't describe everything with force curves. I certainly can't explore what the hell this is. But what force curves do allow us to do is get a true mathematical insight into switches that we wouldn't get otherwise. This is a Franken switch. It's got a meter on cap down. It's in a clicky switch and it's set to clicky mode, so its leaf is back on your way. But just this plot, as a plot of force versus displacement, tells us more about how the switch would feel than anything we could possibly try and get through any sort of switch reviewer, even the good ones like me. But if we take force curves and we look more into them, and we start comparing them against each other, will have ways to quantifiably describe not only linear switches, but now tactile switches that have evaded us for the last 2 decades of this hobby's existence. And so I'm glad that I can share this with you guys for the first time today. And I hope that you guys will continue to work more into this when I post about quantifying compatibility here in a couple of months. So with that, I think we're on to questions. Yes.
At around the like 2.25 mark, you see this, and all the everywhere else, like basically every other curve, that upward force and downward force kind of do the same thing. At that one point, they like are behaving opposed. I'm wondering if you know what's happening there.
I don't know, because this is a really convoluted pressure switch, right? And so if you know about your clickies, they have a click lead that you physically crank in and out to your stack, and it's behaving in this very fashion. My understanding is these sharp features that you get in steep force of yours tend to exist in clicky switches where you're going really quickly over. So if I had a wager of this, I would imagine that that is probably where you just brush past your click lead, and that's what's kind of good. Why that necessarily comes up this way, I'm fairly certain. But I would have to draw probably a very complicated force diagram. Yes.
How closely do you find your tested force curves track to manufacture force curves?
So the question was on how accurate my force curves are to those of different manufacturers. That is a question that is entirely dependent on the manufacturer or the brand publisher. So I can say companies like Gatoron and Kale tend to be pretty good. They have their own force curves machines, and if you push their salespeople enough, they will actually show you what they actually push. Some brands, what they will tend to do though is they will just draw. They'll just take a guess. Like this feels like this, and we'll draw this curve. Akko, as much as I like them, they do make very good switches in place. They're very guilty. So if you ever see a force curve that exists on Akko switches, they do tend to go, okay, well it feels maybe like that. They do tend to be pretty accurate on the listed numbers. So if they say peak force, actuation force, or out force, they tend to be pretty accurate. But I would be a little hesitant to trust force curves that are not from your established bread and butter manufacturers, your Cherries.
I mean, the force curve is technically normal for the switches, but have you thought about positively varying the sound of the switches as well?
The sound of the switches. So the question was if I had thought about looking into the modification of sound of the switches. I have thought about that a bit. That is much more difficult than a force curve machine because you're just effectively measuring the spring possibilities. Sound is difficult, and there have been some people who have tried it. Some of the difficulties that would maybe potentially make that hard is that sound is not ever really isolated from just the switches. A switch itself may sound that way, but I've seen boards at meetups where you put the same switches in 2 different boards. You have this plastic, heavy, foamed out board and they're really hollow metal boards. And then all of a sudden you get 2 entirely different sounding switches. They're the same switch, they just sound way different. And I unfortunately don't have enough of a setup to combine every type of keyboard case, every type of keypad, and every type of switch together and to take those. So it's a thought. It just would be significantly harder and with a lot more caveats to it than perhaps with force curves. Question? Yeah.
Do you find that you go more on vibes or your chart in the switch yourself? Because you can look at all the data, but do you think that's maybe more likely?
Well, I just asked for 3 samples as a comment. That's usually stopped me from having to spend that money. It's a combination of both. Especially nowadays, there are a lot of people in the hobby who talk about switches in vibe sort of ways, right? I like how this sounds. This feels certain ways. And so, kind of whatever your interest is. Me personally, I tend to look for stuff that has interesting numerical or vibes out there. Switches that are extremes in one way or another. You know, switches that might exist, we go all the way back. You know, I might be more interested in a switch that exists here or here personally because those are truly different, not something that exists here. If I have the option to look at the data, I will absolutely look at the data. But it's not the end all be all. Just use it to inform yourself a little bit more about what you know. And on the flip side of that as well, what really helps with reviews, people like to just, oh, I'm going to read this review from at least myself, and they go, holy shit, that was way too much. I can never get use of that. The best reviewers you'll find are the ones who are consistent over time. You don't have to agree with me. In fact, if you 100% of the time disagree with my views on tactile switches, my reviews are still useful because you know I'll just do whatever the opposite of this. Right? And so, if you have a reviewer who's reviewed a lot of switches, when you try and look at those vibes, know where you line up on some other stuff they've done, and that will inform your direction. I think I saw a question over here.
Sure. I was going to ask, you mentioned you didn't have the setup and sound. If you went to the static setup, are the force graphs and I guess the description of sound proportional such that you could model sound based on?
He's read a lot into that statement that I was an engineer, I'm a chemical engineer. I do not know coding. Is that possible? In a very far off world, perhaps. Unfortunately, I am probably not the person for that. You can look at some of the people who have done databases on switch sound, and you can look at my first year database, and you can try and mash them together. In fact, the reason that I publish all of my data on my GitHub is because it is for the community. All of my raw data, my process data, every single thing I've done with these course curves is there for you to see. If you want to give another talk in KeyCon 26 about why everything I just presented is bad, you can. I've given you the data. Good luck. It takes a lot of time to go through all of that, but it's there for you to build it. So maybe you can do that. I probably can. There's another you in the back here.
With different, like, people will describe tactiles like with like a P bump or like a D bump. In collecting your data on those and graphing them out, have you noticed that like the D bumps will like they'll have like a dome shape going over most of the travel of the switch?
Sure. So I have been a little hesitant to use that phrasing because of how, unfortunately, like buzzwords like thok and clack, they tend to be used not particularly well. But I am aware of that notation, and one of the things I would like to do, and unfortunately I haven't been, is see if I can map some of those, oh, this is what everyone says is a D bump, and then show what those switch codes look like. When I actually do write this article and do that, I will try and do that. Mostly just for my curiosity, but it is a good question. Unfortunately, I don't have an answer. Here's another one here in the front.
Do you notice any difference with the force curves when it comes to keycaps and no keycaps?
That's a good question. Do you see any differences between force curves with keycaps, without keycaps? Personally, I have not. The only way that I think you may see differences in that is if your keycaps are really loose, like rock around on your switch. This is effectively a spring that's taped on an elevator. It's just moving on, or like a spring weight that's moving on an elevator. So if your keycap's not sitting consistently, you may get some off-kilter movements. I personally have not seen that, but the force curve meter I have is registered so that like I put this perfectly on top of S10 with or without keycaps. There's really only up and down movement. And the reason that it costs as much as it does is it's very precise in how it moves perfectly. So in reality, if you're typing on them, you may get differences because of that keycap rock, or if you hit it off center. But have I seen that quantifiably? But I've also not really tried super hard to make that up. There's one all the way there in the back.
Are these slots available anywhere? What type of switches anywhere?
So the linearity stuff is, I already wrote about that in an article that's called On Differences in Linear Switches. Yep. So I wrote an article called On Differences in Linear Switches. All of those plots are there. As well in either in one of my Google Drives linked in the archive section, or that there is a fully operatable Excel sheet where you can select your switches and those things. Tactile switches will come in time.
They will come in.
Yeah, so I did plan to have that written before KeyCon, but the last month of my life has been 3 months long. So I've not quite been able to do that. I would imagine that if I have to paint myself into a corner, that on differences in tactile switches article, maybe 2 or 3 months into the future. It kind of depends on how much more I really want to extract out of that operation. That's a good question. Let's see. Yes.
So the machine you use, it says drop sent to you. Is it like a custom machine that they sent? And also, how much does it cost? I'm just curious.
So this is an Imada FSA MSL 0.4 portable force displacement tester. It is bought by Imada. They're a very famous scale and measurement company. The testing stand is semi-automatic, so I have to physically actuate that to move it up and down. So yes, every one of those 2,000 force curves I collected by hand. It's a very slow process, but it's one that I'm glad that I do. You can get automated testing stands, but they tend to exponentiate the price very quickly. This machine, especially just this, I think just the measurement device itself is something like $4 or $4.5 grand. So I'm very thankful for them to have given it to me. I take very good care. Yes, Blue Shirt.
So, 2 questions. Have you been able to measure stiction, like between if you have a palm housing and a palm stem? And have you noticed a difference between a lubricated and an unlubricated switch?
So that's a good question. The question was effectively, summarizing it, is, have you looked at scratch things? Have you looked at scratch, material on material sticking, or differences in loop switches versus not? Unfortunately, I haven't done that processing yet. Where I would look for that is this machine has 2 modes. It has a regular mode and a high resolution collection mode where it's basically collecting like 5 times the amount of speed. That makes the data files a lot bigger and a lot harder to comb through. But I'd imagine if I were to see something, it would be in that direction of high resolution stuff. Unfortunately, I have not done any work in that direction. And there's a question all the way in the back.
When you're measuring the area under the tactile bump, have you thought about normalizing against the overall switch weight?
That would be one way you could do it. That's certainly possible. There are multiple ways you could try to do this. The reason that I chose not to perhaps do that is because your weight is not necessarily consistent, right? If we think about our force curves, we'll just look here for a Zelio switch. If you had to ascribe a number for the weight of that switch, it might be a little hard because your starting force and your bottom of force are a little bit disparate. Could you take an average of that force or something to that degree? Absolutely. This is just what I've chosen. This is actually the very torturous Excel sheet that I did in the background. For those of you who are calculus minded out here, I could not fit a function to that and thus could not integrate it to get an area. So instead what I've done is what is known as a rectangular approximation. I've done that at the limit of what my force curve tester can see. So basically what it is instead of perfectly getting that area underneath, I'm taking little rectangles that stack up and down through that area. And that's what all of this machinery is. Yes?
Can I play with that giant switch?
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Oh, and thank you. That reminds me. So yeah, we'll pass it on. At my table, and we've lost a good amount. This is a linear. I have some demonstrations of, I believe, this plot and a handful of example switches. So if you want to go to my table or try and find my table and it has the space, you should be able to try some of these switches out and see how much that lines up, at least until I get some results. Yes?
Also, like, I'm a tactile guy, so I have about 12 different tactiles in the test.
So yeah, there's also a good opportunity to try out other background switches that exist in people's boards as well. Like I said, I'd love to have had the article together, but that's extenuating circumstances. We can talk about when I'm not here or subject to seeing this again in court. Any other questions?
Do you know where type R's would fall in this plot?
Oh, where would type R's fall in this plot? I'm not certain that type R's exists as one that I've quantified yet. I would imagine they probably exist. If I had to guess by vibes, I'm saying it's probably exists in this region here. It's not nearly as wide and as strong as you would think, but it does exist upward towards that end. And part of the reason that it might not is we're quantifying the positive bump region. The type Rs have a very big negative bump region. That is true to their form. They are all tactile on the front and back, but it exists. And there's also other switches that will have difficulty. I'm going to choose to extend your question a little bit. This method does have some difficulties that exist as well. So some of the difficulties that exist are, yeah, this is all the stuff I want to highlight. So again, so there are some limitations with force curves. So again, the hypothetical line is not the most accurate, but there are difficult to quantify tactile switches. There's ones that I call the taxi bubble bump problem. And you get force curves that look like this, that have what effectively look like two positive bumps. I'm still not entirely certain how I contend with that. 80 boards, grade switches that are more tilt rate like our type Rs may also be an issue. And then you also get weird ones that are, I'm not certain how to this does feel tactile, but it's clearly not. And then we even get weird ones where that starting force exists below the bottom. So it kind of really throws that hypothetical line on first line. I believe that we are out of time, a little over time. So if there are any further questions, feel free to come and ask me. You can actually just run up to me and ask questions. I do respond back quickly. But thank you guys all for showing up.